You can see them previewing, and purchasing, and then downloading. Unless you're building a game, it's important that your animation is not gratuitous. The velocity and position of the animation should directly match the user's gesture. In Keynote, when a user moves a slide in the navigator, we use animation to let them know they've got it. And when they drop it, the other slides ripple away from that area. And because the animation follows actual physics, it makes the experience feel very realistic. And in iBooks, as your finger slides across the screen, the page curls back and directly tracks the user's movement. Matching the user's gesture really makes you feel like you're turning a real page in a book. Be realistic. If your animation isn't realistic, it can be distracting and confuse your users. If you flip an item to show settings like we do in the Weathers app, users will associate the widget with a physical card. They will assume that there's only two sides to the card, and to view the original content, the card must be flipped back over. And in the Photos app, the user can pinch a pile of photos to preview what's inside an album. And the actual photos expand out while you pinch. It feels like you're really picking them up and fanning them out on a table. You don't see the same photo twice because that wouldn't be realistic. So to summarize animation, use animation to smooth transitions and give users feedback about what's going on in your app. And don't be gratuitous. The animation should match the user's gesture as much as possible. And unless your app's a game or game-like, be realistic. Animation, when done well, can make your app much easier to use and really bring things to life. So now I'd like to talk about sound. It's really a shame that so many developers forget to consider sound when developing their app. Like animation, sound can add a heightened sense of realism to your app and create a much more memorable experience. A great audio cue can help your brain better associate an action with its result. Those are some familiar sounds to anybody who's used an iPhone. You want to be careful not to rely on sound as your only form of feedback because the user may have muted their device. But when you do utilize sounds to communicate status, you're often able to reduce the visual noise in your UI. In the real world, you hear sounds all the time when interacting with physical objects. And when you add sounds to interactive objects in your UI, they feel more realistic. For example, when a user changes a value in their standard picker UI, they hear a click at each setting. This subtle but realistic sound reinforces the visual concept that a user is spinning an actual wheel. And in the camera app, we play a traditional shutter sound when a user snaps a picture. Not only does this make the action feel more familiar, but it provides useful feedback that a picture was taken and it's being saved to the device. If you're building a game, sound is an absolute must. Playing a game without sound is like watching a movie without a soundtrack. You can do it, but you won't be able to build drama and tap into the user's emotions the same way. So this is Angry Birds. It's one of the most popular games on iOS, and it's been consistently in the first spot of all paid apps on the US App Store for a long time now. And those of you who have played Angry Birds know how powerful sound design can be. The background music is catchy, but it's really the sound effects that tease and challenge you to conquer levels and seek revenge on the green pigs. So that was sound. Don't forget about sound. Think about how it can be used to provide feedback and status to your users. And if it makes sense, use sound to reinforce interactive concepts. It's an extremely efficient way to make your app stand out and be remembered by users. Having clear language is one of the easiest things you can do to make your app more usable, yet so many developers gloss over this area just like sound. Remember, most users aren't as familiar with your app's features or the technologies that support them. When using an app that has clear, natural language, you don't even think about the text. But when you use an app with ambiguous or overly technical wording, the first thing that you often say is, "This app is too complicated." An easy tip to remember is to label buttons by their resulting action. When you get a text message, the buttons in the alert are clearly labeled Close and View. There's no ambiguity about what either of these buttons do, even if you don't read any of the other text in the alert. If you just label buttons OK and cancel, or yes and no, users will always have to read the entire text, and it will be much easier for them to accidentally select the wrong option. Here's the alert confirmation sheet for deleting a photo. Because the buttons are clearly labeled, the user doesn't need any extra text in the sheet. Just delete photo and cancel. Nice and clear. It's also important that the navigation bars at the top of the screen are clearly labeled. And this is especially helpful if your app has a deep hierarchy or many screens that the user might navigate to. Avoid placing your logo at the top of every view. This is a common mistake a lot of developers coming from the web make. Users won't be able to clearly identify the screen they're on, and it will get very confusing as the user navigates around. There are also a lot of apps with two bars, one for the logo and a second for the nav bar and back button. This not only limits the amount of content that can be displayed, but it also makes it harder to navigate in and out of levels. Remember, users launched the app from your icon. They didn't stumble upon the screen from a search engine or other web link. And the best branding for your app is to create an experience that's great for your users. So label your nav bars. It's also important to label back buttons by the name of the screen that they go to. Remember, this is a mobile device and a user might have received a phone call or been distracted by something else after getting to this screen. In these scenarios, it's really nice to have a visual cue of where the user came from. The fact that it's a left-pointed button in the upper left corner already indicates to users that it will take them back. So just labeling it with the word back isn't that helpful. And you want to be clear and concise with your labels. It doesn't matter if the full name of the previous screen doesn't fit in the back arrow. You just need to give users some sort of clue of where that button will take them. This is a screen from our iPod app. Look how we just used the word more in the tab bar and edit in the nav bar. We use these labels in several of our built-in apps. There's no need to add extra words and say more items or edit display view. Because these controls are in a consistent, logical place, we're able to have nice, short labels that tell the user all they need to know. Most users care about getting stuff done. They aren't as interested in what technology is used in your app. So make your language understandable to your target users. Here in our Settings app, you can turn airplane mode on and off. And this could have easily been labeled something like Disable Cellular Baseband Radio. But most users wouldn't know what that meant. And also in Settings, we have Wi-Fi networks. We don't say anything such as 802.11n, G, B, or A, or SSID, just Wi-Fi networks, something that all users can understand. In the Maps app, we say drop pin, not add new GPS indicator to map. Just drop pin, because that's what the interface is doing, and that's what will make sense for users. And throughout iOS, we abstract the underlying file system. We talk about sharing photos, or playing songs, or watching videos. And when we do talk about files in our Numbers app, we simply refer to them as what they are, spreadsheets. Nowhere will a user see a command like new numbers file, or something labeled untitled.xls, just spreadsheets or the title of the spreadsheet. Remember that the goal is to use terms that make sense to users. So that was language. Make sure you have helpful labels in your buttons and other controls, and keep it simple and make the text clear and concise. Use language that your users will understand. These are some simple rules that will go a long way towards making your app easier to understand and to navigate. So now onto typography. Once your language is clear, you need to make sure that the actual text is legible and beautiful. So here we have our built-in Mail app. When you're browsing through messages in your inbox, the thing that you care about most is who the message is from. So the sender is listed in big, bold text. And as you scroll through messages, the sender's name remains clearly legible. The message's subject is right below the sender's name. And since this information is important, it doesn't have the same visual weight. However, it is more important than the message preview, which is a lighter gray text. If the subject and message preview were the same color, it would be really hard to tell that they're different bits of information. But by visually distinguishing them, there's no need for an extra text label on each line, such as subject : or message preview : Another alternative would have been to make the message preview a smaller font than the subject or a different typeface or color altogether. If we did this, it would be visually busy and too hard to read. When there are too many different typefaces or font sizes in a small area, the most important text won't stand out. All of this text is left aligned, so as the user browses their messages, they can keep their eye in one area and quickly find what they're looking for. Proper alignment really helps make the text easier to read. When you don't have items aligned, the user is forced to read every word on the page, and their eye will have to zigzag across the screen. Even though this is a standard list view, lots of thought and consideration went into the design. When you design your list views and other screens with lots of data, spend the time to make sure the information is organized in a way that makes sense and the text is easy to read. So while the Mail app gives you a good reference point for what we consider legible, you must adapt type sizes for how your app is used. In the Maps app, where we display turn-by-turn directions, the fonts are much bigger because we assume the user is on the go. And in the Stocks app, the user might be checking their portfolio under a table in a meeting or at a restaurant, so you want to make the text very easy to read. If the user has to scroll to see additional items, that's fine. Fitting all the content in one screen really isn't important. Scrolling is one of the most intuitive gestures in iOS, and users won't mind scrolling to see additional items. However, they'll get quickly frustrated if they have to squint to read something or physically bring the device closer to their face. If your app is highly themed, the typeface should match the rest of the UI. In Notes, we use a handwriting font since the app looks like a real notepad. And using the default Helvetica in a highly immersive game like Cut the Rope wouldn't feel as playful as the custom font that they've embedded. But if you saw either of these fonts in the Mail app, they would feel really out of place. If you do use a custom typeface, just make sure that all of the text remains very legible. So those were a few tips to help you improve the typography in your app. Make sure the text is easy to read in all usage scenarios, and make it appropriate. Good typography and information design often goes unnoticed, but it really makes a huge difference in the overall beauty of an app. So remember, screen densities vary. You need to test for legibility on every device your app supports. The iOS simulator isn't a good enough tool to let you know whether your text is legible. So last but not least, we have graphics. One of the best ways to wow your users is to build rich graphics that give a sense of realism to your app. Take advantage of the fact that when a user launches your app, the iPad or iPhone can turn into whatever you want it to be. And when you mimic high-end, expensive materials, the perceived value of your app will go up. Here we see the built-in Voice Memos app. It's a beautiful studio microphone where every detail has been paid attention to, even the light source and the shadow behind it. And underneath, there's even a realistic level meter and chrome buttons to control it. And you can tap on the microphone just to test it. Lots of details were paid attention to here. And this is the Compass app. And here you can see some polished wood and some brass fixtures. And so when you hold it in your hand, it feels like a real compass as you move around in different directions. So here's a metronome app from Steinway & Sons. And you can use it to keep track of the rhythm and tempo when you're practicing an instrument. Because they're using really expensive looking wood, and the bottom area looks like a precise tool, it would feel right at home on top of one of their fancy grand pianos. So this is Hipstamatic. It's an app that comes with all sorts of filters to give your photos a vintage look. And their app looks like a real toy film camera made out of plastic. And on the back, it's even got a film slot, a flash switch, and a viewfinder to compose your shot. Every pixel was paid attention to here. This is